The year is 1836, and the humid air of Texas hangs heavy over Fort Parker, concealing a violence that is about to shatter the silence of the frontier. It is May 19th, a date that began with the mundane, rhythmic chores of settler life but is destined to end in a symphony of screaming and smoke. A 17-year-old girl, heavy with child, stands frozen near the settlement walls, her eyes locking onto a scene that her mind refuses to process. She watches the patriarch of her family, her father-in-law, collapse into the dust after a single, brutal blow, his life extinguished before he hits the ground. Beside him, her mother-in-law falls, her blood turning the dry Texas dirt into a dark, crimson mud. Before the young woman can draw enough breath to scream, before shock can transmute into sound, rough hands seize her from behind, the grip bruising and absolute. She is dragged backward, the heels of her boots carving futile lines into the earth, until she is hoisted violently onto the back of a waiting horse. As the animal surges forward, the settlement, her only known world, disappears behind a veil of dust and distance. She is 6 months pregnant. Her name is Rachel Plummer, and for the next 21 months, she will descend into an existence so harrowing, so stripped of humanity, that even years later, when she is safe within the walls of her father's home, she will tremble at the mere thought of describing it. In the pages of her own published memoir, the ink seems to falter as she confronts the memory. She wrote only this: "To undertake to narrate their treatment would only add to my present distress, for it is with feelings of the deepest mortification that I think of it, much less speak or write of it." Rachel Plummer was not an anomaly. She was a terrifying statistic in a chaotic era. During the 1800s, across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American Southwest, the collision of cultures turned the frontier into a theater of war where the line between combatant and civilian did not exist. Settlements were not just homes, they were targets. Hundreds of women were snatched from their hearths, pulled from the arms of their families, and swallowed by the vastness of the plains. Some were eventually returned, bartered back to civilization after months or years of agonizing negotiation, their eyes hauntingly empty. A rare few managed to escape during moments of chaotic storms or battle, walking hundreds of miles with bleeding feet back toward the safety of forts. But the vast majority were simply never seen again, vanishing into the tall grass of history. Those who did return carried stories that followed them like a shadow, tales they struggled to speak aloud for fear that the words themselves would summon the pain back. These were stories so disturbing, so visceral in their detail, that even 19th century newspapers, publications that regularly printed graphic, gruesome accounts of public hangings, sometimes refused to print them in full. This is not folklore. This is not the exaggerated legend of the dime novel. These are documented cases, sworn court testimonies given under the solemn oath of the Bible. These are memoirs written by survivors themselves, sold to thousands of readers who were desperate to understand the terrifying reality that lay beyond the edge of the map. If you believe history should be faced with eyes wide open, subscribe to the channel, because the narrative that follows is not the sanitized version found in school textbooks. Every raid, regardless of the tribe or the territory, seemed to follow a chillingly precise pattern, a rhythm of violence honed by generations of warfare. They rarely attacked in the bright clarity of noon. They came at the edges of the day, dawn, or dusk, when the light was uncertain, when shadows played tricks on the eyes, and when families were most vulnerable, either waking to the day or settling in for the night. Isolated homesteads were the primary prey. These were cabins situated miles from the nearest neighbor, places where a scream could ring out for an eternity and meet only the silence of the prairie. The violence was executed with efficient, terrifying speed. The men were dealt with first: husbands, fathers, brothers, any son old enough to lift a rifle. They were usually dispatched within minutes, often before they could even reach for their weapons. There was no negotiation, no parley, no mercy. Just the sudden, sharp finality of the raid. Then came the selection. Women of childbearing age were considered high-value assets. They were not just prisoners, they were currency. They could labor, they could be traded to other tribes for horses or gunpowder, or they could be sold through the established slave markets that networked across the northern territories. They could be forced into new lives, compelled to bear children who would grow up as warriors, knowing no other world than the one their mothers were forced to endure. Young girls were taken for a different reason: malleability. Given enough time, a young mind would forget its name, its language, even the faces of its parents. They would become someone else entirely. The elderly, however, were left behind, considered dead weight that could not keep pace with the rapid retreat of the war party. And infants were considered dangerous, not for who they were, but for the sound they made. A crying child was a liability that could reveal a group's position to pursuing rangers or cavalry. The process of eliminating them was not emotional. It was coldly practical. In February of 1851, near the banks of the Gila River in Arizona, a 14-year-old girl named Olive Oatman learned the brutal calculus of this world. Her family had been traveling west, part of a caravan of dreamers seeking a new life, but disagreements over the route had splintered the group, leaving the Oatmans to brave the wilderness alone. They believed they were only days away from the safety of civilization. They were wrong. In a matter of minutes, the silence of the desert was shattered, and Olive's family was erased. When the dust settled and the shouting stopped, only Olive and her 7-year-old sister, Mary Ann, were left breathing. They were not allowed to mourn. They were forced into the desert immediately, driven forward by their captors. Olive later described the agony of that march, walking barefoot through the pitch-black night over terrain that was a torture chamber of sharp stones and thorn-filled scrub. There was no food to sustain them, no water to cool their parched throats, no rest for their trembling legs. Every stumble was corrected with a blow. Every delay was punished with violence. Her little sister walked beside her, injured and silent, too paralyzed by fear to cry, too exhausted to speak a word. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, signaling the dawn, Olive's feet were so damaged that every step felt like walking on broken glass. But she knew that stopping meant something far worse than pain. And this was only the first night of an ordeal that would stretch into years. Once the captives reached the encampments, the true horror of their new existence began instantly. There was no recovery period, no time to grieve the loss of their families. There was no transition. They were expected to work immediately, long before their bodies had healed from the trauma of the march. They were beasts of burden, carrying heavy water skins for miles, gathering firewood until their hands split and bled, digging for roots in the packed, sun-baked soil under a relentless sun. They ate only what remained after the dogs and the tribe had finished: scraps, bones, sometimes nothing at all. They slept in a state of exhaustion that was akin to a coma, only to be kicked awake before the dawn to repeat the cycle. Rachel Plummer, reflecting on the relentless grind of her captivity, later wrote, "I was kept constantly at work from earliest dawn until late at night. When I failed to perform my tasks to their satisfaction, I was punished. My life was one of constant dread and misery. Discipline was arbitrary and sudden. It came without warning. For working too slowly, for showing a flicker of weakness, for speaking a word of English to another captive, or sometimes for no reason that could be explained other than cruelty itself." Olive Oatman spent an entire year under these crushing conditions. Her little sister, Mary Ann, did not possess the physical reserves to survive it. At just 7 years old, Mary Ann grew weaker with each passing week, her body consuming itself. Olive watched helplessly as the child she had promised her parents she would protect slowly faded away in front of her eyes. There was no medicine, no comfort, nothing she could do but hold her hand as the light left her eyes. But survivors who eventually returned to tell their stories said that the labor and the gnawing hunger were not what broke their spirits. The human body can endure starvation. It can callous over against hard work. What broke them was the psychological terror of what happened when they disobeyed, or terrifyingly, when they hadn't done anything wrong at all. In 1838, a girl named Matilda Lockhart was taken at the tender age of 13. She spent 2 years in the abyss of captivity before being returned during a tense negotiation in San Antonio. When she was finally presented to American officials, men who were hardened veterans of the frontier, men who believed they had seen the worst of humanity, they stood in stunned, horrified silence. A woman named Mary Maverick, who helped nurse Matilda after her return, later wrote of injuries so severe, so grotesque, that words struggled to encompass the depravity. Matilda herself, barely able to speak through her trauma, explained quietly how her captors had turned suffering into a routine, how the infliction of pain had become a kind of game to pass the idle hours. And this was only the beginning of understanding what captivity truly meant for Matilda. She learned quickly that pain was a tool used for more than just punishment. It was a source of amusement. Matilda Lockhart was often woken in the dead of night, not by shouting, not by orders to work, but by a sudden, searing contact against her face. Her nose became their favorite target for torture. Night after night, week after week, month after month, her reactions to the burning were their entertainment. By the time she was returned, her nose had been burned away entirely, leaving a ruin of scar tissue. There was little part of her body that had not been marked in similar ways. Her arms, her back, her legs were a map of cruelty that went far beyond discipline. This was not about correction. It was not about control. It was about suffering for suffering's sake. Mary Maverick wrote that the girl was so broken she could barely lift her head. This was not just from physical weakness, but from a shame, fear, and exhaustion layered so deeply into her soul that they could not be separated. Matilda Lockhart never recovered. Not physically, not mentally, not spiritually. She died just 2 years after her return, her body simply giving out, her will to live extinguished. She was 15 years old. Fire, survivors recounted with shuddering breaths, was a tool that inspired a unique, primal fear because it could be controlled. It could be used carefully, deliberately. Sometimes captives were restrained and left exposed, while heat was applied slowly, meant to last for hours. These acts were often theatrical, reserved for sending messages to enemies, to other captives, or to anyone watching from the shadows. More often, however, heat was used casually, as routine discipline, as a warning, as a permanent reminder of who held the power. A piece of metal warmed too long in the campfire. Coals placed on skin where they would not be forgotten. A sudden jolt meant to wake, to correct, to humiliate. Over time, the reaction became expected, almost ordinary, a part of the daily rhythm of horror. But the most terrifying use of fire came as an act of political revenge. In March of 1840, during what was intended to be a peace negotiation in San Antonio, known as the Council House Fight, several Comanche leaders were killed inside the meeting hall. Word of the betrayal traveled fast across the plains. The retaliation did not fall on the soldiers who fired the shots. It fell on the captives. 13 prisoners were restrained and left exposed to the elements. Fires were built nearby. Not large roaring bonfires that would end things quickly, but small, controlled fires designed to roast rather than consume. The ordeal stretched on for hours, a slow agony that defies description. Among the victims was Matilda Lockhart's younger sister. She was 6 years old. Weeks later, when another Comanche band arrived to negotiate for different captives, they brought with them someone who had survived the slaughter. That survivor described what had happened in every agonizing detail. The message was unmistakable. Defy us, and everyone you love will pay in blood and ash. Pause for a moment. Close your eyes and try to consider the reality of this. These were women who had never raised a weapon in anger. Farmers' wives, daughters, mothers, children. People taken from everything familiar, stripped of their identity, and subjected to years of calculated suffering. Some were held for months, some for years, some for decades. What would you have done in their place? How long could your mind have held on his sanity? How long could you have survived? There was another ordeal captives faced almost immediately upon arrival at the main camp, a ritual designed to break them before they ever settled into the routine of captivity. It was called running the gauntlet. The captive was forced to pass between two long lines of warriors, women, and children, armed with clubs, whips, and sticks. Each person struck the captive as they passed. The goal was simple: reach the end of the line without falling. Those who collapsed under the hail of blows were forced up again, often with brutal violence. Those who could not rise faced consequences worse than exhaustion. The gauntlet served several dark purposes. It was a celebration of the successful raid. It was entertainment for the tribe, and it was a test of character. Those who showed resolve, who stayed silent, who kept moving forward no matter how many times they were struck, sometimes earned slightly better treatment afterward. Those who showed weakness, who cried out or begged, marked themselves for more abuse. Rachel Plummer endured the gauntlet more than once during her 21 months in captivity. She learned through bitter experience that showing pain only encouraged more cruelty, that crying was like blood in the water for sharks. They respected bravery more than anything, she later wrote in her memoir. I wish I had known it sooner. By the end of her captivity, Rachel had learned to resist. When one of her captors attacked her, she fought back with such ferocity, wielding a piece of buffalo bone, that the nearby warriors laughed and cheered. Not because they were kind, but because they admired defiance. From that day on, her treatment improved, not dramatically, but enough to notice. Most captives never learned this lesson. They weakened slowly, day by day, until they died in captivity or were returned to families who barely recognized the hollow shells of the women they once knew. Some women faced a different, more complex fate. They were taken as wives. On the surface, to an outsider, this might appear to be a better outcome. They ate with the tribe instead of scavenging for scraps. They endured less random punishment. They had a defined place in the social order. But choice was never part of the arrangement. Young women were given as rewards for successful raids, expected to fulfill every domestic and marital role demanded of them. Resistance was answered with violence until the resistance ended. Some women eventually accepted these lives, not because they wanted to, but because acceptance was the only logical path to survival. Cynthia and Parker was taken at age 9 in the same raid on Fort Parker that captured Rachel Plummer. She did not spend mere months in captivity. She spent 24 years. She grew up Comanche, learned the language, adopted the customs, and absorbed the beliefs. She married a powerful war leader named Peta Nakona and had 3 children, one of whom would become Quanah Parker, the last great chief of the Comanche. By all accounts, Cynthia loved her family. She loved her life on the plains. When Texas Rangers finally rescued her in 1860, she did not view them as saviors. She viewed them as captors. She fought, she begged, she screamed for her husband as they dragged her away. She was taken anyway. Her husband died shortly after the raid. Her sons escaped and vanished from her life. Only her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, was taken with her. For Cynthia, the rescue was not freedom. It was a second captivity. She spent the rest of her life trying to escape, trying to return to the only family she remembered. She never succeeded. She was watched constantly by people who believed they were protecting her. She died in 1870, heartbroken and alien in a world she did not understand. Some historians believe she simply stopped eating after her daughter died of illness, that she chose death rather than live among people who were now strangers to her. She had been saved, and the salvation destroyed her. Perhaps nothing reveals the true, unvarnished brutality of frontier captivity more clearly than what happened to the children. Rachel Plummer's 2-year-old son, James, was torn from her arms during the initial raid on Fort Parker. She never saw him again during her captivity, but it was her second child whose fate would haunt the pages of history. 6 months into her captivity, Rachel gave birth to a son. For 6 weeks, she cared for him as best she could, working with him strapped to her back, hiding him when possible, clinging to the fragile, desperate hope that somehow he might survive the horrors around them. Then, the decision was made. She was told, coldly, that the child was slowing her work. In her own words, she described the moment. "They took my child from me. I never saw him alive again." Rachel was 20 years old. She was eventually ransomed and returned to civilization. Where her father saw her again, he barely recognized his own daughter. She was gaunt, scarred, and her eyes carried a 1,000-yard stare that had not been there before. She wrote her memoir, one of the earliest and most raw captivity narratives ever published in Texas. She tried to rebuild her life. She became pregnant again and gave birth to a healthy son. But the trauma was too deep. 2 months later, her body failed. She died in 1839 before she could truly recover from what captivity had taken from her. Her first child, James, the 2-year-old torn from her arms, was eventually returned to the family in 1842. He was 8 years old by then. He had spent 6 years among the Comanches, long enough to forget his birth family entirely, long enough to forget the English language. Freedom did not feel like home to him. It felt like a foreign country. Olive Oatman was released after 5 years among the Mojave. Unlike her earlier brutal captivity, her time with the Mojave had been complicated. She had been adopted into a family, given land to farm, and marked with sacred blue tattoos on her chin, marks of belonging, ensuring passage to the afterlife. But she was still not free to leave. When she finally walked into Fort Yuma in 1856, she weighed barely 80 pounds. She was dressed in bark skirts. She struggled to speak English, the words coming slowly, clunky, and foreign, as if pulled from a deep, dusty well. Across her chin, 5 vertical blue lines told her story before she ever opened her mouth. Olive became famous. She went on lecture tours. A published book spread her story, and she became a symbol of frontier survival. She married and lived quietly for decades. But those close to her knew she never fully returned to the girl she had been. Her husband reportedly spent years buying and destroying copies of her memoir, hoping to protect her from a past that refused to loosen its grip. Olive kept a small jar of Mojave staples, mesquite seeds, on her shelf until the day she died, a quiet, heartbreaking reminder of a life she could never fully leave behind. By the 1870s, historians estimate that at least 30% of Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache populations had captive ancestry. The line between settler and native was far blurrier than 19th century Americans wanted to admit, far more complex than the neat, binary stories of civilization versus savagery printed in the newspapers of the East. Some captives fully assimilated. They learned the language, adopted the customs, married, and raised children who grew up knowing no other world. When rescue parties finally found them, when families traveled hundreds of miles to bring them home, they refused to leave. They had become someone else. Others returned broken, living reminders of what they had endured. People who startled at sudden movement, who woke screaming in the night decades later, who could never explain to their families what had happened because the words simply did not exist in the English language. And thousands disappeared entirely. No memoirs, no court testimonies, no marked graves. Only names scrawled in faded family Bibles and government ledgers. Old documents tell the story of families who spent the rest of their lives waiting for answers that never came, leaving lamps burning and windows for ghosts. The frontier was not a land of heroes and villains in white and black hats. It was a place of survival, unforgiving and relentless. It was a world where everyone, on every side, did things that would scar the land and the soul for generations. The women who survived captivity carried it forever, in their bodies, in their silence, in the things they could not bring themselves to write, even years later, even in the safety of a feather bed. Rachel Plummer said some memories were too painful to put into words, sealing them away in the vault of her mind. Matilda Lockhart's ruined face spoke volumes without a single word. Olive Oatman's blue tattoo announced her history to everyone she ever met, a permanent badge of her ordeal. They survived what should not have been survivable. They endured what should not have been endurable. They lived when so many others did not. History calls them victims, and they were, but they were also something else. They were survivors. They were witnesses. They were the ones who came back to tell us what happened in the dark places no one else could see, places the rest of America preferred to forget. Their stories matter, their suffering matters, and their courage matters. Because if we forget them, we forget the truth about who we were and the bloody, tragic cost of who we are today.